Ben Johnson won an Academy Award and a Rodeo World Championship. He's the only person in history to have done both. That's not a Hollywood legend, that's a documented fact, and it tells you almost everything you need to know about who this man was. When he finally walked onto that stage at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, he ditched the speech he'd prepared. He looked out at the most powerful room in the entertainment business and delivered 7 words that people are still quoting more than 50 years later. And yet the strangest part of his whole story isn't that moment. It's what almost prevented it. Johnson called the script for that film the worst thing he'd ever put his hands on. He flatly refused to say the lines as written. The only thing that made him reconsider was a phone call that came before sunrise from a dying old man asking him for a personal favor. That one conversation turned the whole thing around. This is the story of Ben Johnson, the last genuine cowboy Hollywood ever produced. And here are 10 things most people have never heard about a man who, by his own admission, valued a silver belt buckle a whole lot more than any golden statue. Number 1. Born in a saddle on the Osage, Francis Benjamin Johnson Jr. came into the world on the 13th of June 1918 near Foraker, Oklahoma, right on the edge of the Osage Indian Reservation. His father, also named Ben Johnson, was a force of nature on the rodeo circuit. He wasn't just competitive, he was dominant. Ben Sr. won the steer roping championship at Cheyenne Frontier Days in 1922, 1923, and again in 1926. At Pendleton in 1927, he set an outright world record, roping 3 steers at an average of just 18 seconds flat. A friend who knew him well put it plainly, you couldn't beat him at anything. He could have roped off a mule and still beat nearly everybody. That's the kind of bloodline young Ben came from, and those words weren't flattery, they were just the truth. Ben Sr. managed the Chapman Barnard Ranch in Osage County, one of the most sprawling cattle operations in the entire state. The spread ran to 75,000 acres and carried as many as 20,000 mother cows at a time. It was a working ranch in every serious sense of the word, not a showpiece, not a hobby farm, but a full-scale cattle operation that demanded real skill from everyone on it. Young Ben was nicknamed Son, simply because he and his father shared the same name and something had to give. Growing up on that ranch, he was surrounded by rodeo hands who were genuine legends in their own right, men like Ike Rude, Everett Shaw, and Louis Brooks. These weren't weekend cowboys. They were the best in the business, and Son watched all of them up close from the time he was small. He was on horseback before he could walk, or close enough to it that the distinction barely mattered. I was a cowboy from the time I hit the ground, he said years later, and nobody who knew him ever questioned that statement. He had no burning desire to be famous, no Hollywood ambitions, no restlessness about the life he was living. His plan was direct and uncomplicated. Take his father's place as foreman of the Chapman Barnard, ride horses, rope cattle, and live out his days on the Oklahoma prairie. That was the whole dream. Nothing more, nothing less. So how does a boy who never once wanted to leave Oklahoma end up becoming one of the most recognizable faces in Western cinema? The answer, as it turns out, involves an eccentric billionaire, a trainload of horses, and a chain of events that Son Johnson never saw coming. Number 2. A boxcar full of horses changed his life. In 1940, Howard Hughes was in the middle of producing a film called The Outlaw, a Western that was already generating controversy before a single frame had been shot, largely because it starred a young Jane Russell. Hughes had the budget, he had the cast, and he had the vision. What he needed, in very large numbers, were horses. The horses needed to get from Oklahoma to Monument Valley, and somebody had to move them. Ben Johnson was 22 years old, working alongside his father on an Oklahoma ranch, when Howard Hughes's crew bought a load from that very property. The job of getting those horses to the set fell to Ben. He loaded them into a boxcar in Tulsa, rode the train out to Flagstaff, Arizona, hauled them by truck across the high desert, and then trailed them the rest of the way into Hollywood on horseback. His pay went from roughly $40 a month to $175 a week, practically overnight. He later summed it up with typical plain-spokenness. "It didn't take me long to figure out this was a good deal." For the rest of his life, he told that story with a grin, always saying he arrived in Hollywood packed inside a carload of horses. It wasn't a glamorous entrance, but it was a true one, and that suited Ben Johnson just fine. Hughes owned a prized Palomino stallion called Cherokee Charlie, heavily insured and not to be touched by the chaos of the set. Hughes pulled Johnson aside and made the rule perfectly clear. Keep that horse away from the stampeding herd of 4,000 head. No exceptions, no mistakes. Johnson heard him, nodded, and got to work. Then Cherokee Charlie bolted straight for the herd anyway. Johnson didn't think twice. He drove his spurs in, pushed his horse hard across the ground, threw a rope with precision, and caught the stallion before it vanished into 4,000 churning hooves and a wall of dust. Hughes was floored. From that moment on, he started riding with Johnson every single day, and he had a habit of rolling up $100 bills and tucking them into Johnson's shirt pocket like it was the most natural thing in the world. But none of that changed how Ben Johnson thought about his place in Hollywood. He wasn't there to be a star. He was there to do a job, and he was extraordinarily good at it. He doubled for John Wayne, Gary Cooper, James Stewart, Henry Fonda, Alan Ladd, Joel McCrea, and Randolph Scott. He even stepped in for Johnny Weissmuller in Tarzan's Desert Mystery. He was the man doing the dangerous work while someone else got the close-up, and he had absolutely no complaints about that arrangement. He was invisible by design, and he liked it that way. Hollywood stardom wasn't something he chased or even wanted. Then a runaway wagon nearly took 3 lives, and nothing was ever quite the same again. That brings us to the third turning point in Ben Johnson's life. In 1948, John Ford, one of the most celebrated directors in the history of American cinema, was deep in production on Fort Apache out in Monument Valley. Henry Fonda and John Wayne were heading up the cast. Johnson was on set doing what he always did, handling stunt work and doubling for Fonda on horseback. It was steady, skilled, anonymous work, exactly the kind he preferred. Then something went wrong. A team of horses pulling a wagon with 3 men aboard lost control completely. The animals bolted, panicked and unstoppable, and the wagon went careening across the hard desert floor at full speed. 3 men were hanging on with everything they had, unable to stop it, unable to jump without risking serious injury. The situation was bad and getting worse by the second. Ben Johnson happened to be sitting on his horse close by when it started. He didn't weigh his options or wait for someone to shout an order. He put his heels down and went after them at a dead gallop, closing the gap across open ground until he was running parallel with the lead horse. Then he reached across, grabbed the animal by the halter, and used sheer strength and horsemanship to drag the whole rig down to a stop. The wagon came to rest. The 3 men were shaken but alive. Most people who saw it said he almost certainly saved their lives that afternoon. John Ford saw the whole thing from start to finish, and Ford was not a man who missed much or handed out praise casually. He called Johnson into his office after the day's shooting was done. Johnson walked in expecting maybe a small bonus or a minor speaking part thrown his way as a thank you. What he got was something else entirely. Ford handed him an envelope. Johnson opened it and started reading. As he told it himself years later, what caught my eye was 7-year contract and $5,000 a week. I stopped reading, grabbed a pen, and signed it. I didn't even ask what I had to do. $5,000 a week in 1948. To put that in any kind of human terms, this was a man who had been shoveling manure for $40 a month less than a decade earlier. In one afternoon, without planning it, without auditioning, without wanting it at all, Ben Johnson went from anonymous stuntman to full member of John Ford's legendary stock company. The question now was what Ford intended to do with a cowboy who had never sought the spotlight but could ride a horse better than almost anyone alive. Number 4. John Ford turned Ben Johnson into a leading man, and he didn't do it gently. Ford wasn't the type to ease anyone into anything. He picked you up and threw you straight into the deep end, and that's exactly what he did with Johnson. Johnson's first credited role came in Ford's Three Godfathers in 1948, sharing the screen with John Wayne and Harry Carey Jr. It was a baptism by fire in every sense. Johnson later called it the most physically demanding picture of his entire career, and coming from a man who spent his life on horseback, that said something. Ford followed that up by casting him as the romantic lead opposite Terry Moore in Mighty Joe Young in 1949, a very different kind of picture that showed Ford believed Johnson could carry more than just action. Then came the cavalry films. Ford gave Johnson the role of Sergeant Tyree in She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, and then Trooper Travis Tyree in Rio Grande, slotting him into the final two installments of Ford's legendary cavalry trilogy, alongside John Wayne. These weren't small parts. Johnson was woven into the fabric of some of the most celebrated westerns ever put on film. But Ford's greatest act of faith in Johnson came with Wagon Master in 1950. He didn't just cast Johnson in that one, he built the picture around him. Johnson played Travis Blue, a horse trader hired to guide a group of Mormon settlers across brutal desert terrain. It was a role that demanded presence, physicality, and quiet authority, and Johnson delivered all three. The film became one of Ford's personal favorites among everything he ever made, which is a list that includes some of the most admired movies in American cinema history. Think about what that meant. Ben Johnson, a man who had never once sat through an acting class, was now the centerpiece of a John Ford production. That's not a small thing. That's an extraordinary thing. Ford also made sure his stars earned their moments. During the filming of Rio Grande, he demanded that Johnson, Harry Carey Jr., and Claude Jarman Jr. perform a Roman riding stunt, which meant standing upright on the backs of two galloping horses at the same time, not sitting, standing, on two horses, moving at full speed. Ford gave them 3 weeks to learn it, which by any reasonable standard was not nearly enough time. Johnson and the others pulled it off anyway, and the footage they produced remains one of the most breathtaking practical stunts committed to film in that entire era. Johnson's own take on all of it was classically understated. "I wasn't a good actor," he said, "so I had to be able to do something." That kind of blunt honesty was as much a part of who he was as the writing itself. One of the most striking stories from this period came during the shoot for She Wore a Yellow Ribbon out on location in Monument Valley. A thunderstorm rolled in fast and hard. Lightning was cracking against the sandstone buttes. The crew wanted to shut down and wait it out. Ford refused to stop rolling. "We were pretty scared of the lightning," Johnson recalled years later, "but we were more scared of John Ford, so we kept shooting." That decision to push through paid off in a way nobody could have predicted. The storm footage they captured that day helped cinematographer Winton Hoke take home the Academy Award for Best Cinematography. Fear of Ford, as it turned out, had its uses. But here's the thing about John Ford. The same man who could build a career from nothing could dismantle one just as quickly, and that's precisely what happened next. Number 5. Ben Johnson told John Ford to go to hell. Now, to understand why that's such a remarkable sentence, you have to understand who Ben Johnson was as a person. He was quiet, he was polite. He was easygoing in a way that most people in Hollywood simply weren't. He avoided confrontation the way a sensible man avoids a coiled rattlesnake, just giving it wide berth and moving on. He wasn't looking for fights. He wasn't trying to make enemies. He was just trying to do his job and do it well. But every man has a line, and on the set of Rio Grande, John Ford found Johnson's. Ford was notoriously brutal with his casts and crews. Not firm, not demanding in the way great directors sometimes are, genuinely cruel. He singled people out, humiliated them in front of the entire company, screamed at them, tore their confidence to pieces, and seemed to take a particular pleasure in doing it publicly. It was the kind of behavior that powerful men in Hollywood got away with for decades, and Ford had been getting away with it for a long time. Johnson took it for as long as he could. Then one day, he didn't take it anymore. The exact details shift a little depending on who's telling the story, but the core of it stays consistent. By Johnson's own account, he looked John Ford directly in the eye and told him to go to hell, just like that, plainly, clearly, and without much decoration. Johnson probably figured the storm would pass. These things sometimes did. Ford would rage, things would cool down, and life would move on. It didn't work out that way. Ford did not cast Johnson in another picture for well over a decade. That wasn't a cooling-off period. That was a verdict. And according to Harry Carey Jr., Johnson's closest friend through much of his life, there may have been a second incident that deepened the freeze. Carey Jr. laid it out in his memoir, Company of Heroes. When Ford was putting together The Sun Shines Bright in 1953, word got around that Ford wanted Johnson for the film. Johnson's agent picked up the phone and called to negotiate a higher salary. Ford, who viewed himself as a man who bestowed opportunities rather than bargained over them, took that phone call as a personal insult. He wasn't going to be squeezed, not by an agent, not over Ben Johnson, not over anyone. He held that grudge for years, and he never once flinched. Johnson didn't go crawling back to Ford. He didn't send apology letters or ask mutual friends to smooth things over. He just kept working, quietly and stubbornly, the way a man does when his pride won't let him do anything else. Supporting roles filled his calendar. Shane in 1953. Television westerns that kept his face familiar to American audiences. Gunsmoke, Bonanza, The Virginian, Have Gun, Will Travel. It wasn't the career he'd been promised, but it was a career, and he showed up for every day of it. He survived without Ford. He just couldn't fully flourish without him. And somehow, despite everything, the two men stayed friends. The professional exile never killed the personal bond. Ford's respect for Johnson had never really gone anywhere. It had just gone quiet. And years down the road, that respect would surface again in a way neither man could have anticipated at the time. But before any of that, Johnson had one very personal piece of business to settle somewhere far outside the walls of any studio. Number 6. He won a world championship and went flat broke doing it. In 1952, Ben Johnson's father died of cancer. He was 56 years old. The loss landed on Johnson like something physical, like a blow he hadn't seen coming even though he'd known it was on its way. Ben Sr. hadn't just been his father. He'd been a world champion roper, a man of iron discipline and genuine skill, the toughest and most admirable person his son had ever been around. Now he was gone, and Johnson was left to figure out what to do with that grief. He made a decision, and it was a big one. He told Hollywood to wait. He pulled himself off the studio circuit and announced he was going to spend a full year competing on the professional rodeo circuit. Nobody in the industry quite understood it. This wasn't a publicity move. There was no angle to it, no contract incentive, no press opportunity hiding underneath. He was doing it because his father had been a champion, and he needed to find out if he could be one too. "My dad was a world's champion 3 or 4 times," he said later. "So, I wanted to be." In 1953, aboard a horse named Steel, owned by his father-in-law Clarence "Fat" Jones, Ben Johnson entered the Rodeo Cowboys Association Team Roping World Championship and won it. Just like that, he stood in the same territory his father had once occupied. Champion. It meant everything to him. The financial reality of it, though, was something else entirely. After entry fees, travel costs, lodging, and all the miscellaneous expenses that come with a year on the rodeo circuit, Johnson had broken exactly even. Not a profit, not a loss, just a long, hard year that left him with almost nothing to show for it in dollar terms. "All I had was a wore-out automobile and a mad wife," he said, and he wasn't exaggerating. He didn't have $3 to his name when it was over. He went back to Hollywood not because the industry was calling him home, but because he genuinely had no other option. Still, he carried that championship with him for the rest of his life, and he made sure anyone who asked knew exactly how he felt about it. "I've won a rodeo world championship," he said, "and I'm prouder of that than anything else I've ever done." The big silver buckle they handed him that day meant more to him, he insisted, than any award Hollywood would ever dream up. He became the only person in recorded history to hold both a World Rodeo title and an Academy Award. That's a combination nobody has matched before or since. But the Oscar was still nearly 20 years out at that point, and the road leading to it would pass through some of the most brutal, blood-soaked filmmaking Hollywood had ever produced. Number 7. Sam Peckinpah nearly lost him before a single frame of film had rolled. By the mid-1960s, Johnson's career was slowly climbing back towards something that resembled momentum. He turned up in Clint Eastwood's Hang 'em High in 1968, and Will Penny that same year, two pictures that reminded audiences he could anchor a scene without a word of explanation needed. But it was a different kind of director entirely who would hand Johnson the most intense screen roles of his life. Sam Peckinpah, brilliant, volatile, and almost constitutionally incapable of running a peaceful set, saw something in Johnson that most people in Hollywood had been sleeping on for years. Their first meeting, though, nearly ended everything before it had a chance to begin. Johnson showed up to interview for Major Dundee in 1965 and walked into a scene he hadn't been prepared for. Peckinpah was in the middle of publicly tearing apart a stuntman, dressing him down in front of the entire crew with no apparent concern for the man's dignity or feelings. Johnson watched it. He let it land. Then he stood up, looked Peckinpah directly in the eye, and said what he was thinking without softening a single syllable. "I can't work for you," he told him. "If you did to me what you did to that man there, I'd hit you right in the damn nose." That was Ben Johnson. No performance, no calculation, just the plain truth delivered straight. Peckinpah had no patience for anyone on earth except Ben Johnson. That exception meant something, coming from a man who made enemies the way other people made friends. Johnson later said he pulled the director out of bar fights in just about every town they filmed in, hauling the drunken, pill-fueled Peckinpah back from the brink more times than he could count. By his own estimate, he saved the man's life around a dozen times. That bond paid off on screen. In 1969, Peckinpah cast Johnson as Tector Gorch in The Wild Bunch, one of the most daring and genuinely disruptive westerns Hollywood had ever produced. Johnson stood alongside William Holden, Ernest Borgnine, Robert Ryan, and Warren Oates. That is not a cast, that is a monument. The film's slow-motion violence rattled audiences to the core and reshaped what the Western genre was even allowed to be. Johnson kept that working relationship going well into the next decade. In 1972, he appeared in two more Peckinpah pictures built around Steve McQueen. The first was Junior Bonner, a quiet, melancholy rodeo drama that didn't chase big box office and didn't pretend to. The second was The Getaway, a tight crime film that hit much harder commercially. Two completely different films, same steady presence at the center of both. But the role that would define Ben Johnson's entire career didn't come from Peckinpah at all. It came from a 31-year-old former film critic named Peter Bogdanovich, and Johnson wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. In 1970, Bogdanovich was putting together an adaptation of Larry McMurtry's novel, The Last Picture Show. The story was a quiet, aching portrait of a dying small town in 1950s Texas, a place slowly losing its memory of itself. Bogdanovich had a specific actor in mind for Sam the Lion, the aging man who runs the pool hall and the local movie theater and functions as the town's quiet moral anchor. The character was the beating heart of the whole picture. He needed Johnson. Johnson read the script. Then he put it down and said no. "It was the worst thing I ever read," he said flatly. His complaint wasn't vague. He said nearly every other line given to his character contained a dirty word, and that wasn't something he was willing to do. "I don't do dirty movies, and I don't have to say four-letter words around women and kids to make myself a name." He also threw out a secondary objection for good measure, complaining that Sam the Lion had far too many lines of dialogue altogether. When Bogdanovich repeated that second complaint to John Ford, Ford just laughed. That's what he says about every script. Ford knew Johnson better than Johnson sometimes knew himself. Bogdanovich was stuck. He had the perfect actor for the most important role in his film, and that actor had turned him down cold. There was only one possible move left. He went to John Ford directly, the one man on the planet with enough standing to walk Ben Johnson back through that door. And that is exactly where the phone call from the cold open of this story falls into place. One morning about daylight, the phone rang, Johnson later recalled. It was John Ford, and he asked me, "Ben, would you do me a favor?" I said, "Yes, sir." I wasn't smart enough to ask him what it was. He said, "I want you to do Bogdanovich's picture." That was it. No argument, no sales pitch, just Ford asking, and Johnson agreeing, because that was the only answer that made any sense. Johnson did agree, but he came with one firm condition attached. He would rewrite his own dialogue personally, stripping out every piece of profanity in the role. Bogdanovich didn't push back for a single second. He needed the man in front of his camera, and he knew it. Whatever Johnson needed to say the words, Bogdanovich was willing to let him say them his way. What followed genuinely shocked the film industry. The full story of what happened next is coming right up. Filmed entirely on location in the small West Texas town of Archer City, the last picture show was shot in black and white, a deliberate choice that gave the whole picture a dusty, timeless weight. Ben Johnson's defining scene in that film is a quiet, unhurried monologue delivered beside a stock tank, where his character reflects on the great love of his life, the one that got away. Critics and filmmakers alike have placed it among the finest pieces of screen acting in American cinema history. It's not a showy moment. There's no swelling score, no dramatic lighting cue written into the script. It's just a man talking, and it's devastating. Peter Bogdanovich shot it in nearly a single take, and something remarkable happened on that very first attempt. The sky had been overcast all morning, flat and gray, and then, right in the middle of Johnson's speech, the sun broke through. It fell across his shoulders like a stage spotlight that nobody had ordered. Bogdanovich had the instincts to keep the camera running, and what ended up on film was the kind of moment that can't be rehearsed or repeated. The movie went on to earn 8 Academy Award nominations, which was extraordinary for a low-budget, black-and-white picture made outside the studio system. It had cost just $1.3 million to produce, and it returned roughly $29 million at the box office. It won 2 Oscars. Cloris Leachman took Best Supporting Actress for her performance. And Ben Johnson, the cowboy who'd spent decades being told he couldn't act, who had never sat through a single acting lesson in his life, who had quietly rewritten his own dialogue because he flat refused to say anything profane on screen, walked away with Best Supporting Actor. That alone would have been enough, but the recognition didn't stop there. Johnson also won the BAFTA Award, the Golden Globe, and the New York Film Critics Award, 4 major honors, all for the same performance. He was never one to let things go to his head, but even he seemed to appreciate the sweep of it. "I won an Academy Award, a Golden Globe Award, and the New York Film Critics Award," he said, "and I didn't have to say one dirty word." On the 10th of April, 1972, Johnson stood at the podium inside the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion for the 44th Academy Awards. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his prepared speech, looked at it for a moment, and then folded it back up and put it away. He held the Oscar statue up to the light, grinned, and said, "Boy, ain't that purty?" The audience laughed, and then he thanked Bogdanovich, John Ford, the cast, the crew, Columbia Pictures, and the people of Archer City by name. And then he closed with 7 words that nobody in that room, or watching at home, has ever forgotten. This couldn't have happened to a nicer feller. The place erupted. It remains one of the most loved acceptance speeches in the history of the Oscars, not because it was polished or carefully written, but because it wasn't. No rehearsed humility, no political posturing, no carefully staged tears. Just a real cowboy standing at the biggest podium in Hollywood, being exactly the man he'd always been. After the ceremony, a reporter caught up with Johnson and asked the predictable question, would the Oscar change him? He didn't hesitate for even a second. "All my life, I've been afraid of failure," he said. "To avoid it, I've stuck with doing things I know how to do." He refused to inflate his salary demands off the back of the win. He wasn't going to play the Hollywood game just because the industry had finally decided to take notice. "After I won that old Oscar, everybody thought I knew something," he said. "I didn't know any more than I did before I won it, but they thought I did." That kind of clear-eyed self-awareness was rare in that town, and it's a big part of why people loved him. Which brings up a question worth sitting with. Did winning the Oscar open the door to the kind of leading man stardom that the performance clearly earned him? Did Hollywood come calling with the big dramatic roles, the top billing, the franchise opportunities? The answer is more interesting than a simple yes or no. Number 10. The last real cowboy left the arena on his own terms. Ben Johnson never chased the spotlight after winning. He didn't hire a new agent, didn't move into a bigger house, didn't start holding out for leading roles he'd spent 40 years not needing. He kept working, steadily and quietly, exactly the way he always had. He showed up, he did the job, and he went home. That was his entire philosophy, and winning an Academy Award didn't shake a single bit of it loose. One of his first post-Oscar credits was Steven Spielberg's debut theatrical feature, The Sugarland Express, released in 1974. And even there, Johnson was content to be part of an ensemble rather than the name above the title. His film roles ranged wide and ran deep. He brought Melvin Purvis, the FBI agent who hunted John Dillinger, to life in John Milius's 1973 film Dillinger. He shared the screen with Gene Hackman in Bite the Bullet and went toe-to-toe with Charles Bronson in the rugged Western thriller Breakheart Pass. He carried the lead in The Town That Dreaded Sundown in 1976, then showed up in the Cold War action film Red Dawn in 1984. By the time his career wound down, his filmography stretched past 300 titles accumulated across nearly 6 decades of steady, committed work. But here's the thing about Ben Johnson. The movies were never what drove him. The horses were. The arena was. In 1985, he channeled that passion into something lasting, founding the Ben Johnson Pro Celebrity Team Roping and Penning, a traveling charity event that moved from arena to arena across the country, drawing crowds and raising money at every stop. He gave several $1 million of his own money to children's charities over the years, not once making a public spectacle of it. In just 2 years alone, he raised more than $67,000 for organizations including the Salvation Army Youth Center, child crisis shelters, and Arizonans for a drug-free youth. These weren't token gestures from a celebrity looking for good press. This was a man quietly writing checks and showing up in person because he genuinely believed it was the right thing to do. He established a $1 million research chair in pediatric cancer at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center, a contribution that would outlast any film role he ever played. When asked about his generosity, he kept it simple. "When I do get a little ahead," he said, "I see what I can do to help others." That was the whole philosophy, stated plainly, without any performance behind it. He married Carol Elaine Jones on the 31st of August, 1941. She was the daughter of Clarence "Fat" Jones, who was Hollywood's most relied-upon horse supplier at the time, which tells you something right there about the world Ben Johnson moved through even before the cameras started rolling. He and Carol stayed married for 53 years. She passed away in March of 1994, and Ben never remarried. He operated a horse breeding ranch in Sylmar, California, and held on to property in both Oklahoma and Arizona. He steered well clear of Hollywood parties, had little patience for phoniness of any kind, and lived according to a personal code he once summed up with a single sentence. "Honesty is like a good horse," he said. "You know it'll work any place you hook it." His close friend, Harry Carey Jr., himself a veteran of Ford's stock company, once let slip something that most people never would have guessed about the man who'd galloped fearlessly alongside stampeding wagons, with nothing between him and disaster but instinct and nerve. Ben Johnson was terrified of flying in airplanes. The most daring stuntman of his generation, the man who'd done things on horseback that no camera trick could replicate, wanted absolutely nothing to do with air travel. It's the kind of detail that makes someone feel real, not like a legend, but like a person. John Ford, never a man who wasted words on sentiment, offered Johnson something close to a final blessing in the last meaningful exchange between them. "Ben," Ford told him, "don't forget to stay real." Coming from Ford, that was everything. That was the highest praise the old director knew how to give. On the 8th of April, 1996, Ben Johnson collapsed from a heart attack while visiting his mother, Ollie, who was 96 years old at the time, at Leisure World in Mesa, Arizona. He was 77. His nephew, Ben Miller, made a point of noting that just the weekend before, Johnson had competed in a roping event and had roped better than he had in years. He went out the way he lived, active, competitive, and close to the things that mattered most to him. Think about what he was, really. A cowboy from Oklahoma who never truly wanted to leave, a stuntman who fell into stardom almost by accident and was never entirely comfortable with it. A world champion who placed more value on a silver belt buckle than on a golden Oscar. A man who stood on the biggest stage in the entertainment world, walked up to that podium with no speech prepared, and told the plain, unvarnished truth to everyone watching. That moment said more about him than any role he ever played. "Everybody in town's a better actor than I am," Ben Johnson once said. But none of them can play Ben Johnson. He was right. Nobody could. There was only one, and the world of classic Hollywood was richer for every year he spent in it. If Ben Johnson's story is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to Golden Secrets and stick around. There are plenty more legends from the Golden Age waiting to be told properly, and we're just getting started. See you in the next one.